He raised his boot. Not his hand, his boot. Leather, heavy, aimed at the woman he married. And the only thing standing between her ribs and that kick were 2 little girls in red dresses, screaming. She hadn't run. She hadn't begged. She'd waited. 3 years of waiting. 3 years of pouring his drinks and absorbing his contempt and filing every piece of evidence he handed her, without knowing he was handing her anything at all. And tonight, while his boot hung in the air and his daughters screamed his name like a warning, every single trap she had ever built snapped shut. Before we go any further, if you're new here, this is Velvet Noir. We tell stories about the women who stayed quiet long enough to win. If that's your world, subscribe, pull up a chair, because tonight, you're going to want to see how this ends. The Greenwich estate was the kind of house that looks like a life but feels like a cage, marble floors, high ceilings, every surface selected to impress people who would never live inside it. Her husband, Lee Sung-yeon, didn't live there either. He occupied it. There's a difference. She had stopped seeing the beauty in it 14 months ago. The day she found the first invoice that didn't add up. The day she sat in the quiet of the lower study, looked at a number that made no sense, and understood with the specific clarity of a woman who has been waiting for the truth, without knowing she was waiting, that she had been lied to in ways that were going to require patience to dismantle. She had patience. 11 hours until the soul flight. The SEC trigger was already in motion. She just had to survive the night. This is the story of a woman who decided not to be destroyed. Chapter by chapter. One quiet move at a time. She heard his car before she heard him. That was always how it worked. The engine on the gravel. The particular silence after it cut. She had learned, in 3 years of marriage, to read the quality of that silence the way sailors read pressure, not for what it was, but for what it predicted. Tonight, the silence was the worst kind. She looked at the twins. Hana and Sora were at the kitchen table in their red dresses. Sora had decided months ago that red was the only acceptable color, and Venita had chosen not to fight battles that didn't matter when the one that did was already in progress. They were drawing, heads bent, completely absorbed, the way children are before the world teaches them to watch the door. Upstairs, Venita said. Calm, even. The voice she used when she needed them to move without understanding why. Door closed. They went without argument. They were 3. They already knew. She heard his footsteps in the foyer before he appeared. Heavy, deliberate, each one placed with the particular weight of a man constructing his grievance in real time. Lee Sung-yeon entered the kitchen the way he entered everything, as though the space owed him a better version of what he was about to find. He was handsome in the way that power makes men handsome, not through any specific feature, but through the absolute certainty that he should be looked at. He went straight to the drinks cabinet without acknowledging her, poured 2 fingers of scotch, stood with his back to her. She waited. She had learned early that filling his silences gave him ammunition. So she folded her hands on the folder she'd been reviewing, and said nothing. The bid, he said finally, still facing the cabinet. You want to explain to me how I lost the bid. The filing was correct. The capital wasn't there. He turned. She held his gaze and didn't soften it the first time in 3 years she had let him see that her composure was a choice rather than a limitation. She watched the recognition move across his face. The shock, then the offense, then underneath both of those, something that lit like a fuse. Good. She needed him angry. She needed what anger did to his judgment. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that 6 hours earlier, before he had even left his office, she had filed the final whistleblower documentation with the SEC. 3 years of evidence. Offshore accounts. Kickback structures. A decade of calculated theft mapped in passwords and transfer logs she had obtained from a keylogger installed on his home terminal 11 months ago. The authorities were already moving. And at 6 a.m., a car would arrive to take 2 little girls named Hana and Sora to an airport, where 2 one-way tickets to Seoul were waiting under their names. She had found those tickets that morning, in his briefcase, while he slept. She had photographed them, replaced them, called her attorney before the sun fully rose and said 4 words. Tonight. We move tonight. 11 hours. She just had to keep him in this house, angry enough to show his hand, controlled enough not to run until the walls finished closing. You look like you have something to say, he said. I'm listening, she said. You're the visionary. He believed her. He always believed her. That was the last advantage she had ever needed. 3 weeks before the night of the boot, there was a gala. Venita wore champagne silk, understated cut, small earrings. She had dressed deliberately like a backdrop she had learned, years earlier, that the most useful place to stand in a room full of powerful people is the place they've already stopped looking. Sung-yeon worked the room the way he always did, loud, orbiting. She followed at the precise distance that read as devoted wife and felt like field observation. Every exchange she catalogued, every name she filed. My wife, he said, pulling her forward when she was useful. Finance background briefly, before we married. More of a hobby, really. Marcus Webb, senior partner at a firm with quiet exposure to 3 of Sung-yeon's shell structures, glanced at her with polite, immediate dismissal. She smiled, said nothing. What Sung-yeon had never understood about her silence was that it was not submission. It was inventory. She was building a map of who knew what, of where the pressure points were, of how much weight each one could hold before something gave. She had been building it for 14 months. Tonight she was adding 2 more names to it. Later, near the bar, she let her elbow catch the edge of a wine glass. Merlot spread across the sleeve of David Cheng, lead investor in Sung-yeon's upcoming tech bid. I'm so sorry, she said, reaching for a napkin. 12 seconds, eyes down. He doesn't have the capital. The bid is cosmetic. Pull your commitment before Thursday. She straightened, caught the calculation moving behind his eyes, and walked away before anyone could connect the exchange to anything. 3 weeks earlier, she had routed Sung-yeon's proprietary bid data to his primary rival, through an intermediary with no traceable connection to her. She had timed it to surface at the exact moment it could do maximum structural damage. Not from anger, from strategy. She needed him to lose this bid. Badly, publicly, in front of people whose respect held his ego together. A man who wins stays careful and controlled. A man who loses visibly, humiliatingly comes home with his armor cracked and his judgment compromised. And that was when the evidence she needed would finally show itself. She had one more thing to find before she could move. She just needed him angry enough to stop hiding it. What she didn't know yet was that it was already waiting for her. Not in his behavior, but in his briefcase, in his home terminal, in an email she hadn't yet read that would change the entire shape of what she was building. The discovery that started everything was not dramatic. It never is. 14 months before the night of the boot, Venita had been paying household invoices when a consultancy charge appeared that she didn't recognize. Quarterly. Significant. She cross-referenced it against his business accounts and found it appeared there too twice, under different service descriptions. A small inconsistency, the kind most people attribute to administrative overlap and move past. Venita did not move past things. She said nothing to him. She wrote the name down, tucked it in her coat pocket, and drove 40 minutes to a library in a neighboring town where she paid for parking in cash and used a computer with no connection to their home network. She had not yet known what she was looking for. She had known enough to begin looking quietly. What she found was a structure patient, layered, professionally constructed, designed to be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Offshore subsidiaries. Kickback arrangements routed through a consultancy that existed only as a name in a registry in the Isle of Man. Years of diverted funds, built on the foundational assumption that no one around Lee Sung-yeon was intelligent enough to trace them. She spent 3 months learning to trace them before she touched anything. The keylogger she installed on his home terminal 11 months ago had run for 8 weeks before she recovered it. It gave her passwords, account numbers, the full map of everything he had built and hidden, and then, in its final week, something she had not prepared herself for. An email from his attorney. Subject line, negligence file custody contingency. She read it twice, kept her face still, kept her pulse where she needed it. His lawyer had been constructing a preemptive case for months. Erratic behavior, emotional instability, a paper trail assembled from selected half-truths, designed to ensure that when Sung-yeon filed for divorce, a court would hand him the twins. He had not been planning to leave her. He had been planning to take them. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark study for a long time. She did not cry. She had already done whatever needed doing with her grief during the year she had spent understanding what her marriage actually was. What she felt now was something cleaner and more useful. She opened a new document. She wrote 2 words at the top of the page. Full scope. And she started again, from the beginning, with a different objective. The clock started at 5 p.m. That was when the SEC acknowledged receipt of her documentation. She received the confirmation on her secondary phone, 3 years of evidence. Received and logged while standing at the kitchen window, watching the girls chase the dog across the back garden in their red dresses, completely unaware that the world was reorganizing itself around them. She allowed herself 10 seconds. She looked at them. She breathed. Then she called her attorney and said, Tonight. We move tonight. By 5:30, the asset freezes were initiating. By 6, she had spoken directly to the police captain. She made both calls from the lower study in a voice so level it could have been a conversation about school schedules. When she came back to the kitchen, Hannah looked up and asked if she was okay. Always, Venita said, and in the way that mattered, she meant it. By 6:40, she heard his car on the gravel. She sent the twins upstairs. She folded her hands on the folder she'd been reviewing and waited. He came in like weather jacket still on, jaw working, the bid loss sitting on him like something he hadn't yet decided how to direct. The confrontation in the kitchen took 11 minutes. She let him see, for the first time, that her composure was a choice rather than a limitation. She watched the fuse light behind his eyes. Good. She needed him reactive. She needed him to stop thinking clearly about anything except her. He poured a second drink, then a third. She stayed. She answered his questions in the same calm voice. She did not tell him that his accounts were already frozen. She let him believe he was still in a marriage negotiation while the walls finished closing around him. By 9, he had moved to the study. She cleared the kitchen. She checked the girls asleep, Sora's arm around Hannah, the dog at the foot of the bed, and stood in the doorway long enough to memorize the specific quality of that stillness, the way the lamplight sat on their faces, the way they breathed without knowing they were being watched over. She closed the door softly and went back downstairs. By 10, she was at the kitchen table with a glass of water she didn't drink, going through the confirmation documents one final time. Not because she needed to, because the discipline of checking had kept her alive in this house for 3 years, and she was not going to stop now, not in the last hours of it. At 11, she heard him on the stairs. She tracked his footsteps, study, hallway, bedroom, and listened until the house settled. She sat in the dark kitchen and listened to it breathe. At midnight, she made her last call. Her attorney. 30 seconds. He's in the house. On schedule. See you at the gate. At 12:15, she went upstairs, changed her clothes, came back down, and took her position near the foot of the stairs with the folder and her phone, and 3 years of patience compressed into a stillness so complete it had no edges. She had 6 hours until the soul flight. She had everything she needed. She waited for him to come and find her. At 9 o'clock, she moved to the foyer. She chose the position deliberately near the foot of the stairs, a folder of documents loose in one hand, her phone in her pocket recording since his car arrived. The foyer had sightlines to the front door and the upper landing both. It had the staircase. It had 15 feet of ceiling and marble floor, and the particular acoustic quality of a space that amplifies everything. If something happened here, it would be clearly, completely legible. He followed her. She had known he would. "You've made me look like a fool," he said. His voice had dropped to the register he used when he wanted to be frightening. She had watched it work on other people, staff, associates, rivals, the way it compressed the air in a room, narrowed options, made people want to agree just to make it stop. She felt none of that. Fear had been replaced, months ago, by something colder and more precise. "You lacked the capital," she said, again, flatly. She let him see that she was not going to soften it. Not tonight. Not ever again. He moved to the entry table and seized the phone she had placed there that morning. The burner. She had built the message chain over 3 days' names, timestamps, the texture of an affair that had never happened. She had seeded it carefully, not to be believed indefinitely, but to be found tonight, when his judgment was compromised enough to accept the most flattering version of events available to him. He read it. She watched the transformation move across his face, the fury cooling into satisfaction, the satisfaction into certainty. He believed he had caught her. He believed the story was his now, and that it explained everything. Her coldness, her distance, her refusal to be afraid of him. He had found exactly the narrative she had written for him. His actual phone buzzed in his pocket. The automated access alert from his offshore accounts. He didn't check it. He was too busy constructing his vindication. She watched him stand in the center of the trap, holding a fiction she had written, and feel like the smartest person in the room. She let him have that feeling. It was the last one he was going to get. He moved into her space slowly. That was always the most frightening version of him, slow, deliberate, the violence of it contained and aimed. She felt the banister against her spine. She held the folder against her chest and kept her eyes on his face and did not move. "You've embarrassed me for the last time." He used his bulk rather than his hands. He had always considered hands too legible, too common, too easy to describe afterward in a police report. He pressed her hard into the banister, the wood biting into her back, the breath shortening in her chest. And then he stepped back and looked at her with the expression she had seen him turn on other things, the flat, final look of a man who has made a decision. He raised his leg. Slowly, deliberately. The leather boot heavy, mirror-polished, the boot of a man who treats every surface of himself as a statement came up in a measured arc, not rage, intention. Aimed at her ribs, at the stairs behind her, at the precise, calculated humiliation of putting her down in her own home and stepping over her. Stop! It came from above. It split the room, not one voice, two. Hana and Sora stood at the top of the staircase. They had not stayed in their room. They had crept to the landing in their red dresses with the particular, terrible knowledge of children who have learned to wait for the sound of danger. Their faces were wet. Their eyes were wide and ancient in the way that children's eyes become when they have seen too much too early. They did not run from him. They ran toward him. Hana hit the bottom of the stairs and locked both arms around his standing leg, her full weight thrown against him, her face pressed into his trousers, screaming without words. Sora seized the fabric above his raised knee with both fists and pulled 22 pounds of furious, terrified love hauling against his balance with everything she had. His leg wavered. He lurched sideways. The boot came down wide and hard and cracked against the marble floor like a gunshot, missing Venita entirely. He looked down at his daughters, not with horror at what he had almost done, not with remorse, with irritation, the genuine, flat, dismissive irritation of a man who has been interrupted by something that doesn't factor into his calculation of what matters. That expression, captured on a live feed, would later be described by the presiding judge as the most clarifying piece of evidence submitted. Get off me. Venita took the phone from her pocket and held the screen toward him. Live feed, active, 2 recipients visible at the top of the screen. The red indicator pulsed. The police captain has been watching for 4 minutes, she said. Her voice was the same voice she used to read bedtime stories. The SEC has been watching for 6. The girls pressed against her legs. She did not look away from him. The gate is already open. Through the high windows, headlights swept across the ceiling. Nobody moved. The foyer held its breath. The only sounds were the soft crying of 2 exhausted little girls and the slow, inevitable crunch of tires on gravel unhurried. The sound of something that had been set in motion long before tonight and could not be called back. Sung-Yun stood in the center of the room, and the room looked different around him. The ceilings were just ceilings. The marble was just cold floor. The space that had always amplified his presence now simply contained him. And he looked for the first time since she had known him like a man who understood that the structure he had been standing on was no longer there. He reached for the performance anyway. It was all he had left. The police, he said. He straightened his jacket. He rolled his neck. He found the voice. For a domestic dispute? I own the commissioner. And the SEC on what basis? I'm the smartest. You're the loudest, Venita said. It was never the same thing. She stepped forward. The girls moved with her. Every time you explained your strategy to me over dinner, you thought you were educating me. She held his gaze the way you hold something that has already been resolved. Every time you walked me through your accounts because you needed someone to admire them. Every time you corrected my understanding of your own business structures. You handed me the case piece by piece for 3 years because it never occurred to you that I was building anything with it. His face changed, in stages. The confidence went first, then the performance. Then, underneath both, something she had rarely seen: the actual man, stripped of everything he had constructed around him, looking at the wreckage of a life he had believed was invulnerable. She had not expected to feel anything about that. She felt something. She didn't look away from it. She let herself see it clearly, the smallness of him, the fear in him, the thing he had spent his entire adult life making sure no one would ever see, and she understood, in that moment, that this was why he had needed to be the loudest. Not because he was powerful, because he was terrified that without the noise, there was nothing there. She had outgrown pity for him long ago, but she saw him, for 1 second, clearly. Then she reached past it and continued. Your associates were arrested 53 minutes ago, the commissioner included. He reached for his phone. His hands shook. He opened the offshore account, the emergency exit, the one he had built for exactly this, the funds he had always planned to run on if everything else collapsed. Balance, $0. She had moved the funds during the argument about the injunction. 4 transfers, clean and untraceable, executed between sentences while he stood 6 feet away believing he was winning. "You drained me," he said, barely a voice, barely a man. "I protected my daughters," she said. The front doors opened. 3 officers. Behind them, a woman in a gray suit, Venita's attorney, who had been parked at the gate for 25 minutes, walked in with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment since long before tonight. "Lee Sung-yun, you are under arrest for felony domestic assault and multiple counts of financial fraud." He looked at the room one last time, at the officers, at Venita, at his daughters standing beside their mother in their red dresses with their faces still wet and their eyes steady, watching him with something that was neither hatred nor love and was far more permanent than either. He opened his mouth. Old habit, the voice that had always cleared the room. Nobody looked at him. He was let out through the doors he had always walked through like they owed him something, his expensive shoes catching against his own marble floor, smaller with every step. The courtroom was his kind of room. He understood rooms like this, the architecture of authority, the way posture and tailoring and the right attorney could move perception independent of truth. He had operated in rooms like this his entire life. He sat at the defense table in a suit that still fit him and wore the expression he had practiced, wronged, dignified, above this. His attorney was excellent. Her opening was precise. She moved directly to the prenuptial agreement, the document he had placed in front of Venita 10 days before their wedding, when the venue was booked and the invitations had gone out and the cost of walking away had been carefully engineered to feel insurmountable. The agreement was constructed to leave Venita with nothing, a clause buried in technical language dense enough that a non-specialist would miss it entirely, which was, of course, the point. His attorney laid it out with the confidence of someone who has never experienced the ground moving beneath them. Venita's attorney waited. She was younger than opposing counsel expected and quieter, with a stillness that had been misread throughout these proceedings as inexperience. She let the presentation conclude, let the silence that followed become genuinely uncomfortable. Then she placed one document on the table, 41 pages, tabbed, annotated in a precise, unhurried hand. It traced the origin of Lee Sung-yun's seed capital, the foundational funds that had built the first company, which had built the second, which had eventually constructed an empire he had described in interviews, a biography, and a keynote speech as the product of his singular entrepreneurial genius. The funds had been embezzled from a family trust, Venita's family trust, executed when she was 19 years old, before she had legal standing to access or protect it, buried under paperwork so deliberately obscure that it had taken 14 months, a forensic accountant, and the specific patience of a woman who had decided to look for everything before she moved on anything. The prenuptial agreement governed the distribution of his assets. It said nothing about hers. The silence in the courtroom was the kind that follows something irreversible. "There is no marital asset," Venita's attorney said, into the middle of it. "There is only a debt." The judge took 17 minutes. Venita was awarded 100%. She walked out into the flat winter light with one twin on each side of her. She didn't pause on the steps. She didn't look back. She had spent enough of her life in rooms that belonged to someone else. Time is not neutral. It moves differently depending on what you've built with it. For Sung-yun, it moved with the slow precision of a life being systematically reduced. 4 years in a federal facility where nothing was tailored, and his name opened no doors. Release into a city that had redistributed his professional network among people still worth knowing. A small apartment. Search results that returned nothing he would have chosen. He had been the loudest man in the room for so long that the silence was the thing that finally undid him. Not the arrest, not the conviction, not the asset loss, the silence, the absolute, total indifference of a world that had simply moved on. For Venita, the same years moved like velocity. She rebuilt methodically, not with his money, but with hers. The assets reclaimed from the trust. The company she built under a new name, in a direction she had been planning long enough that the execution felt inevitable rather than urgent. Within 4 years, it was profitable. Within 7, it was something. She moved the girls out of the Greenwich estate the week the proceedings concluded. Wood floors, a garden, a neighborhood where the air wasn't pressurized with the particular tension of a home that has been militarized, a dog that Sora named after a color, rooms with light in them. Hana and Sora grew up watching their mother work not the performance of ambition but the actual, quiet labor of it. Contracts at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, Decisions made in the same measured voice that had once told a police officer the gate was already open. They watched her be uncertain, sometimes. They watched her move through uncertainty without pretending it wasn't there. They grew up knowing what they had seen in the foyer. That knowledge doesn't unhappen. Venita understood that, had built her response to it carefully, with the help of a therapist she trusted, and the discipline of a mother who refused to let her children be defined by the worst thing they had witnessed. She answered their questions honestly, in language calibrated to their age. She did not ask them to forgive him. She did not ask them not to. She worked on her own forgiveness for a long time. She eventually stopped. Some resolutions don't arrive as forgiveness. They arrive as clarity, the moment when a thing no longer has weight, not because it's been absolved, but because you've outgrown it. She had decided that was a legitimate ending. She had decided she was allowed to choose the resolution that was real, rather than the one that looked better from the outside. 11 years after the night of the red dresses, a television interviewer asked her in front of a live audience of several thousand people what she considered the source of her success. She sat with the question for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, because she wanted to say it exactly right. I learned that real power doesn't announce itself. It works quietly, and it waits, and it moves when the time is exactly right. She paused. And I learned that a woman who has decided to protect her children is one of the most formidable forces that exists, not because of anger, because of clarity. The camera found her daughters in the wings. Hannah, second year of a corporate law degree. Her mother's stillness, her mother's eyes. Sora, 20 months into her first company, with the focused energy of someone who watched, from childhood, how it's actually done. They were not screaming. They were standing straight, watching their mother with the quiet recognition of people who know what they are looking at. The audience applauded. Venita smiled. The real one. The one that had taken years to come back and now arrived without effort. The smile of a woman who has nothing left to manage, nothing left to hide, nothing left to survive. As Maya Angelou once wrote, "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." Venita Shawn decided. Every morning of those 11 years, she decided. And to everyone still inside this story, this is Velvet Noir, where justice is patient, power is quiet, and the women who outlast the noise are always the ones who win. If this world feels like yours, you already know where you belong. Subscribe, stay. The next story is waiting. But before you go, one question. At what moment did you realize Venita was always in control? Was it the shell companies, the keylogger, the live feed? Or was it the very first time she poured his drink, looked him in the eye, and said absolutely nothing?